Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to this Regional Studies Association seminar. Thank you to everybody for joining us. So the Regional Studies Association is a global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development and policy. And it supports its members with the latest research, funding schemes, networking and publishing opportunities. So before we start the seminar, just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded and we'll be making it available on the RSA Lounge. And we'd also ask you if you could put your questions for our speaker in the Q&A box throughout the event, and that would be fantastic. And we'll also be tweeting as well, so you can tweet using the hashtag RSA webinar if you're interested in tweeting. And just before we start, I think it's important to do a couple of quick introductions. So my name is Caitlin Robinson. I'm an academic fellow and pragmatic lecturer in human geography in the School of Geographical Sciences at the University of Bristol. But most importantly, I'm very pleased to welcome today's speaker is Elisabetta Pietrostefani, who is a lecturer in geographic data science in the Geographic Data Science Lab at the University of Liverpool. So Elisabetta is a quantitative urban geographer. She's interested in applying data and technologies to improve the understanding of urban development and inequalities. So I'm going to hand over to Elisabetta to get started.
Thank you so much, Kate. Just gonna, here we go, share my slides, and I hope that everyone can see them. Yeah, thanks so much, Kate, for the introduction. It's great to be here today. I'm going to be talking about new forms of data, which is a pretty hot topic, and how they are being more and more used in different areas of geography, whether it's economic geography, geographic data science, different types of quantitative geography, and yeah, hope to kind of give some motivation for why this is interesting and how it will be more and more interesting, I believe, moving forward. So first of all, just a bit of an intro on why we're even talking about this. Data is a huge topic at the moment. Everything produces data more and more, and it's become more widely available, whether that data is spatial or not. It basically meaning that we have more quantitative representations of the world that might not have been so available in the past. But data in itself is not that useful. It's actually about insights, and gathering data is great, but until you make it tell a story, until you present something that is of interest to whether it's researchers, policymakers, governments, etc., what's the point? So one of the things I'm going to be focusing on today, as I'm a lecturer in geographic data science, is the spatial aspects of these data. And indeed, a lot of this new data is spatial. What I mean by that is that it's got usually a longitude and a latitude. You can put it somewhere on a map in whichever way. And in many cases, this is special because it means that we can look at patterns in space of lots of different data, of lots of different things that we weren't really able to look at 10 years ago, even 5 years ago in some cases. But we don't really want to reinvent the geographic information systems wheel, so how do we build on it? So this comes from actually something I teach, and slides inspired by Danny Arabas-Bell, where we look at good old spatial data to then understand why new forms of spatial data are so special. So what's meant by good old spatial data is that it's collected for the purpose, it's carefully designed, it's usually super rich and informative, and countries that consider this data very useful, whether it's to track socioeconomic trends or inform policy interventions, collect this type of data like the census or like Understanding Society in the UK on a regular basis. However, what's the problem? It's massively, well, it's quite costly, and it's a massive enterprise. I'm not saying that, this good old spatial data shouldn't exist. However, let's look at the advantages of new ways of going forward as well. one of the other main disadvantages of traditional data forms is that it's quite coarse in resolution. So we often don't know how things are in space, spatially allocated in a lot of detail. So what are new forms of spatial data? Well, they're usually accidental. They're created for a different purpose, a purpose that we didn't, that wasn't really envisaged for research or for possibly policy analysis. But this also means that it's quite diverse in nature and resolution and quality. It can come in many different formats. It's usually quite messy. And so cleaning it and getting it into a format which we can use is sometimes difficult. There's quite a nice paper by Elisabetta 2014, which talks about different forms of this type of new data. One is bottom up, so citizen as sensors, how citizens create data on their own, whether knowingly or not, and how this can inform different types of research. And I will be presenting an example of this within the different examples I will be talking about. A second is an intermediate, which is usually data that's generated by businesses, whether they're digital or not, but by businesses which kind of either collect or generate data because they're doing it anyway, and sometimes they make it accessible. So, for example, all social media generates data. Some of it is now more accessible to researchers or not. Obviously, it comes with lots of problems. And then there's also a top-down form of this data, which is usually governments which are increasingly making data available and accessible. So what's all the fuss about? And I'm just putting this out there so that then I might not have time to fully reflect on this on the papers that I will be presenting, but something to reflect on when we think of new forms of spatial data. The first is the opportunities that it brings. So it's obviously massive. There's a lot of it. Passive in the sense that we're not actually generating it purposefully. It is being generated. There's an element of nowcasting, meaning that we have it all the time. In some ways, in some types of data, it's every minute of every hour of every day. So that's a very new thing. And that it's often on social systems. So we have details of how social systems work, which we didn't necessarily have before. And sometimes it can even act as a natural field experiment because again, going back to the nowcasting, it's always on. It's sometimes being constantly collected. Main challenges, and these are big ones, whether it's especially when it's research that may want to have a policy outcome, but also in terms of how this data is handled, is that there's a huge bias in some of these data sets that are available. Because sometimes they're not representative of general populations. We're not sampling for them and making sure all parts of the populations are actually covered. There's technical barriers, going back to the quite messy bit. So the data can be quite messy a lot of the time in terms of cleaning, and also in terms if you want to match it with other pre-existing data. So yeah, this can be challenging. There's also often a methodological mismatch in the sense that the data is generated by lots of different companies, entities, citizens, and so the formats are not standardized. It's not a simple Excel file that you can download and is cleaned and has a standard code and a standardized names, and which is quite easy to work with, or more easy anyway, than these new forms of data. So what I'm going to do now is go through different examples, kind of to give a taste of possibilities, and which I find particularly interesting, and trying to go through different types of data. I'm going to be talking about satellite data as a new form, then at citizen-led data, or at least one example of it, social media, and mobile phone. This is really just a taster because I'm going to focus on a few examples. There are many, many more. So forgive me if I don't cover an example that is of your particular interest. We can perhaps speak more in the Q&A. So first of all, remotely sensed data, satellite data, and what type of opportunities it can bring. So here we've got an article published in Science quite a few years ago now, which combines satellite imagery and machine learning to predict poverty. So as many of you know, there's a huge issue in terms of socioeconomic data in data poor countries. So this paper takes different examples, different countries, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, Malawi, and Rwanda, and using a convolutional neural network, it trains imagery in order to identify variation of local level economic outcomes. This is really interesting in contexts where survey data is not as available, and it does a pretty good job of using the machine learning techniques and limited training data sets to predict poverty in these countries. And it's really offering this example up as a methodology that that can be transposed and developed in other areas. So this is really a really interesting example because it can have a very applicable policy outcome for these countries, both at a national level and a subnational level. It's quite an accurate prediction. It's relatively inexpensive, and it's a methodology that can be applied in many different places. So moving on, this is some research I've been working on for a few years on using a similar technique, but for a different purpose. So in this case, what I've been using is satellite data from Maxmar. Maxmar makes available satellite data at extremely high resolution when there is a disaster. So in this case, I was looking at the Beirut blast, but they make it available for a lot of environmental disasters around the world as well. And because of the high resolution of this data, it can really track differences before and after such an environmental or human-made disaster. So in this case, it provides quite a good measure of the damage of buildings, especially that occurred in Beirut before and after the blast. But what I was specifically interested is moving one step forward, so bringing it back to a socioeconomic question. And in this case, I focused on trust in government, so quite a social issue. And bringing together the satellite data and survey data on the ground to see what influence being affected by the blast, specifically if your building was heavily damaged or not, had an influence, testing whether it had an influence on your trust in different government types. And it's a different in different analysis. The reason why I presented this together with the other paper by Jean et al. Is to kind of give some motivation of how these new forms of data can a bit inventively be paired with more traditional forms of data to inform policy, or to inform policy questions that interest policymakers. Next up, I'm going to be talking about an example of citizen-led data. So in this case, we're talking about pictures. Article by Chen, Aribas-Bell and Singleton from Liverpool, and they use Flickr images to understand the dynamics of urban areas of interest. Now, this is really interesting because what they've essentially done is use Flickr images and where they are concentrated in different areas of London to identify specific urban areas of interest. Now, for some of you may know that London is essentially a set of lots of different villages in Greater London, and it's quite interesting that according to the cluster size that they decide to use, because they are using a spatial clustering method with some noise, so they can adjust the cluster size, and accordingly you can see that there are different clusters of pictures that come up in different areas of London. Now, this can be really useful for planners, for example, or for local authorities, which might, want to know more specifically what are, areas of interest that are, the areas that are of particular interest to different populations. And also if we have metadata, even very simple metadata on the producers of these Flickr images, then policies can be developed without actually running a survey, without actually asking questions. Of course, it doesn't mean that this should be used on its own, but it's really interesting, especially as it's not like these users were taking these images for this purpose. Going back to the definitions of new forms of data, it was the data was generated and then used for a purpose, which again can be interesting to different types of planning or policy agents. Next up, social media. So there are many examples of how social media data has been used recently, especially with regard to sentiment analysis or opinions. But in this case, I'm going to take an example from Leisure Douglas et al., and where they've used Facebook advertising data to track internal displacement during the Ukraine, in the first 6 months of the Ukraine conflict. And it's quite interesting because it's the type of data about internal displacement which is extremely limited given the conflict. Of course, the IOM, they have a data tracking matrix, and they have done this online for Ukraine under the conflict. However, that also has its own limitations in terms of number of respondents. So what they've managed to do with this Facebook data, also disaggregating it by age and sex, which gives more information about the types of movements according to socio-economic or at least demographic profiles. They have been able to estimate that 5.3 million people were internally displaced away from their main administration within the first 3 weeks of the start of the conflict. So this can, of course, be extremely useful, whether it's for aid, whether it's for future planning, whether it's for understanding displacement in terms of people going back to their homes, whether it's during the conflict or at the end of the conflict. And as you can see here to the right, they've done quite they've done some interesting analysis on male-female differences, children, retirees, to actually unpick the different types of movement according to demographics. So lastly, I'm going to move to mobile phone data. Also, lots of possible bias, but not as much bias as ethical issues with using mobile data. However, it can also be a really interesting form. And this is a working paper by myself and a wonderful PhD student we have at Liverpool, and Francisco Rowe, where we have essentially tried to carry out a similar exercise to the social media data example I just presented, but using smartphone GPS data to explore internal displacement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict again. And we find some very similar patterns. And what's really interesting is that we can disaggregate people's movement at a very fine spatial level. The data that we used to look at this displacement was every hour of every day for 8 months, so extremely, extremely detailed. Of course, possible limitations in terms of the GPS data that we are used because it's linked to phone apps that the data that the people that we have the data from were using. So obviously who uses certain apps versus others. However, the sheer number, so that the large quantity of data would still suggest some, that the trends are accurate. And what's reassuring is that they are very similar to the trends that are identified from the other paper with social media data. So as a reflection to end this short discussion, I just wanted to give some food for thought, of possible ways of using these forms of data in quantitative geography, economic geography, that can be useful for impact and for, policymakers. So, there are many. That this list is just food for thought. It's not comprehensive in any way. So in terms of satellite data, of course, very useful for monitoring the environment in this day and age, extremely important moving forward. For monitoring economic activities, although obviously this needs some processing because we can't just take satellite data as or for example, night lights data is quite aggregated, so as a proxy for economic activity without some processing. It could be used for improving agricultural practices, enhancing lots of different emergency responses. I touched upon this. Social media data can be used for different types of public sentiment analysis, also combating disinformation, being wary that there is a lot of misinformation out there. Enhancing emergency responses. Social media data has been used for this as well, although I haven't presented any works on it today. Mobile phone data could be very useful for urban planning and infrastructure. Obviously, mobility, touched upon it. Health surveillance, although ethical problems with that as well. Monitoring economic activity, possibly. And citizen-led volunteer geographical information for also in a range of things, some of which community engagement, local knowledge integration, disaster preparedness and response, of course, and monitoring social equity, just as, some different options. So yeah, thank you very much. My Twitter handle is there for anyone who wants to get in touch, or my email, and really looking forward to everyone's questions.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much, Elisabetta. So we've got quite a few questions have already come in, but keep popping your questions in the Q&A box. So the first question is from Lucille, who asked about your thoughts on how new forms of data can be accommodated by those who must deposit data after their research projects. So thinking then about kind of the curation and archiving of these new forms of data and how to preserve them.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So one of the limitations with, obviously, when you're often granted access to these new forms of data, they are highly sensitive. Therefore, recurating them to deposit them, I haven't actually had experience with this, but it can be quite limited unless you do it in a highly aggregated form. So I would say that a disaggregated form of this type of data could be deposited, but then would have to go through quite rigorous ethical checks in terms of the new uses. It couldn't just be downloadable. It's just too sensitive in most cases. Apart from in specific examples, so for example, satellite data, when it comes to a disaster, it is made widely available, obviously not over time, but just the before and after, so that NGOs, policymakers, researchers can use it. But in non-sensitive cases, if we look at the current case in the Middle East, obviously the satellite data has not been, openly shared. I hope that answers the question.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got another question here about some more detailed information about how you handle these types of data, and particularly in thinking about when you're mixing data with more standard data. So could you provide some more detail about that and your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. There's a lot of pre-cleaning involved in this type of data set, and usually the pre-cleaning involves getting the data to a format which is as close as possible to a more traditional standard format. So if you're working, for example, with point data, which has coordinates, you want to, get it in a format that is as close to a coordinate data that you would be able to download, or you would aggregate it at the smallest geographical level. In the UK, that would be an LSOA. But in a sense, handling it means also transforming it to a standardized format.
Brilliant. We've also had a question about whether in participatory mapping practices, there's always a question about to whom the data belongs to. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, in most cases with participatory mapping, the data that everyone needs to be very aware from the beginning, and this needs to be disclosed in terms of to the data collectors and the citizen science, depending what the format is, whether it's standard data collectors or citizen scientists or citizens themselves who are volunteering, that if they are contributing this data, so for example, when you take OpenStreetMap, you are making it part of a common creative license for anyone to use, and that's part of having open source data sets. Often the example I provided with Flickr was different. Flickr has made data sets available online, but obviously there's limitations in the metadata that is attached to the images that are made available. It's good to be wary of the permissions that you give when you're collecting or giving or uploading data that you may have generated in whichever way.
Great, thank you. Another question here asking about how you go about accessing, for example, data from mobile apps, some of the logistics of that.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So in terms of data from mobile apps, so GPS data, it's usually through a third-party provider that there are several of them who collect this type of data from different apps, essentially, and collate it for a given country, region, location. I wouldn't say it's an easy process. I would say that you need to, first of all, there needs to be a data sharing agreement between your institution and the third-party provider. You need to make sure that it's only handled in certain secure places, and also the data attached to it is usually extremely limited, as in you've got location, you've got a time, and that's it. You know nothing about who was using that app, obviously, because otherwise they would be identifiable. And already the fact that you know where that mobile phone was for many, many hours of many, many days is extremely sensitive.
Yeah, I guess related to that, there's a couple of people who've asked questions about the ethics of some of these new forms of data and thinking about things like privacy and consent, and whether you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was at an event, a hackathon, a few weeks ago, and we really talked about the ethical issue of, well, mobile phone data especially. And I think that I mean, obviously this is a discussion to continue having and to be had, but I think the main thing is that especially when it comes to many of these types of data, it needs to be securely handled. So go through ethical approval in terms of how it's going to be used, where are you going to handle it, make sure there are no leaks in terms of, because there are many actors which might use it for, let's say, not for purposes which are could be problematic, whether putting people in danger, whether it's the original people who collect, who the data is about, but also future people. Obviously, this is why in some conflicts satellite data is not disclosed, or with mobile phones it is highly secured. So I mean, there are lots of ethical issues to be considered. I mean, thankfully, as researchers in universities, we have to go through quite rigorous ethical approval in order to publish and in order to have access, and that's certainly the next step. In terms of other types of institutions, I would know less about that, but European agencies have similar types of ethical approvals.
Brilliant. We've also had another question here asking whether you could say a little bit more about the data that you use in addition to the satellite data in the case of Beirut.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. I think it's Christine. So that was data that was funded by data that was collected with funding from the UKRI, actually on different occasions, not by just the UKRI, but also the Royal Geographic Society in the UK. So it was very traditional survey data, but the interesting point was to match it, isn't to see to what extent very fine-grained satellite data, and here I'm talking about 1 meter by 1 meter, so you can literally see, a notebook. Well, you could if there was a notebook on the street, but the interesting bit was to put these together. Not that the survey data in itself is not interesting, but it's a very traditional data format. So of course, in that case, we're not just talking about new forms, but of bringing together different forms of data to see how one can inform the other and how they can be used together. And in some cases, if new forms of data, such satellite data, can replace or partially replace running very long, very costly, time-consuming surveys, as interesting as they are.
Brilliant. So we've actually got lots more questions, so I'm going to just take a couple of extra minutes over our time allocation to try and get through some of them. So we have a question here, again, related to satellite data and whether this is accessed via EU programmes and space agencies, and whether UK researchers are still entitled to use that data post-Brexit.
Yeah, thanks for that. So the data that I've mostly used from satellites has been from Maxmar because they pre-process it, so it's helpful. But yes, Copernicus has a program where you can, if you're a researcher, even in the UK, you can apply for access to certain data sets. And I'm happy to, I'm not sure who's asking the question, but happy to put you in touch with the relevant people if of interest. Yes, we are, UK researchers can still use it. You have to go through a series of protocols and permissions, but yes, we haven't lost access.
Yeah. We've also got a question here thinking about in terms of the pre-cleaning of data to address some of these mismatches in the diversity of sources. Do you have any recommended best practices with regards to that?
Well, I think definitely best practices is something that most researchers, including myself, have learned making mistakes, is to be as clear and detailed in the code that you produce to clean this data as possible, because otherwise you go back months later and you've completely forgotten why you did what it is that you did. So in this case, using scripting scripting everything that you do in the cleaning process is what I would advise. And then of course, if you're collaborating, using whether it's GitHub or some kind of shared platform that will help you. GitHub, you can make it private, so it's not like this is that I'm not suggesting that you would make the cleaning publicly accessible if it's highly sensitive data, just to clarify. But yes, to just make sure that every step is recorded in such a way, which is, I think, what a lot of data scientists are, including myself, sometimes lazy about. Oh, I'm coding fast and I'm not creating I'm not putting as much text in comments. So later on, you might forget a specific aspect. And to make sure your data file structures are organized. It's really a 101 thing that I think we can all improve.
And then another question around replicability issues. Given that in many cases, the raw data is coming from kind of digital footprints data is privately provided and not easily accessible. And what are the concerns around
Yeah, for that, I mean, over the last few years, not so much when I was still doing my PhD, but over the last few years, I'm really trying to make a point of making as much as many things as possible open source. And I would say that, of course, even though the data is often private, you can still provide a snippet of, or an even made up example. So, you know, some synthetic example of just some rows of how the data was when you received it. And then you can provide the code to clean it. So in that case, making it quite reproducible, because if you knew the format the data was in and you have the scripts to clean it, it can be reproduced. I think, yeah, I mean, creating a synthetic, you know, just 10 rows of, you know, the original format would then help and aid, and then making it publicly accessible on GitHub or similar. That would make everyone's life easier. And I've learned so much from people who have done that and posted their scripts on GitHub, making, you know, my research much quicker. So I think it's everyone helps each other type of situation.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for all those questions. So we haven't got time to quite reach the bottom of the questions list, but I think we should probably draw it to a close. So just wanted to say a big thank you to our speaker, Elisabetta, for a fantastic talk, and also for all of the organisers behind the scenes who are making it run very smoothly. There's going to be another.
Thanks so much, Kate, for chairing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, there's going to be another professional development webinar on the 14th of February with Tim Brockle in the University of Stavanger, who'll be talking about an introduction to social network analysis. So please do join in February for that. And there'll be further information about future webinars on the RSA website, and you can also find out more information about membership there as well. But we're going to leave it there for now. So thank you ever so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next seminar.